Welcome to the Korea Society. Tonight we are thrilled to welcome Gina Chung to celebrate her debut novel, Sea Change. Gina Chung is a recipient of the Pushcart Prize and a 2021-22 Center for Fiction's Susan Camille Emerging Writer Fellow. She holds an MFA in fiction from the New School, and her work has appeared or is forthcoming in the Canyon Review, Catapult, and the Rumpus, among many others. And she also has been recognized by several contests, including the American Shorter Fiction Contest, the Los Angeles Review Literary Awards, and the Plowshares Emerging Writers Contest. She'll be joined in conversation tonight with our old friend, Francis Cha, the author of the best-selling novel, If I Had Your Face, which was named one of the best book of the year by Time Magazine, NPR, and BBC, among other publications. Her children's book, The Goblin Twins, set in Korea and New York, is forthcoming this September. For those of you in the audience here, both Sea Change and If I Had Your Face are on sale, and both authors will be happy to autograph your copy after this program. We would like to thank You and Me Books for handling the book sales tonight. And for those of you who are watching the live webcast, Sea Change is available wherever books are sold, including You and Me Books website. You will also have a chance to ask your questions to Gina tonight. For those of you who are joining us online, you can send your questions via email, artsandculture@koreasociety.org. And now, with not much further ado, please welcome Gina Chung and Francis Cha.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm so excited to talk to Gina tonight. I first heard about this book before it was a book, long before it was a book, and it was a few years ago. And she was very, very humble and downplaying it a lot. And it was during an interview when my book was coming out. And then when I asked her what she was working on, she kind of mumbled something about, an octopus, and it's her. The protagonist is the caretaker for a giant Pacific octopus, and her boyfriend has just left on a mission to Mars. And I was like, what? So if that isn't the most killer elevator pitch for a novel, I don't know. I've never heard a better one. So when I actually received the book, because I was pestering her for a copy right away, and I was truly just stunned by how beautiful it was, just tonally, just everything about it astounded me. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
It's an incredible accomplishment. And I also wanted to ask you, did you think you were going to die before it published? Because that's a common thing with debut novelists. I certainly thought so. I was like, oh, well, pandemic, I'm going to be dead before this hits the stores. But did you ever think that?
Oh my God, I love that question. Also, just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you to the Korea Society for having us here tonight, and You and Me for selling books. And thank you so much, Francis, for doing this with me. I love your book, and it's such a pleasure to chat with you about this. I kind of did think about that a lot while writing, in terms of thinking about, maybe I'll die before I ever finish this book, before it ever sees the light. I think, the circumstances in which I was writing were pretty extreme. We were all kind of going through it in the fall/winter of 2020. I also feel like maybe this is the right venue for this thread of conversation. I feel like worrying about or thinking about death as a motivator is also a very uniquely Korean thing, maybe.
Yes.
It's just like an ever-present.
Morbid.
Yes, which I love. I think it's like, a big thing for me in my work and just as a person. So, yeah. Thank you for opening with that question.
So obviously we have this beautiful cover and the other main character, Dolores, who is this giant Pacific octopus. And I have never wanted a pet before, but now I really want a giant Pacific octopus. Can you talk a little about how the idea first, came to you and what the writing process and the research process was?
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea for the book, it actually started out with just a line, and I was in my MFA program at the New School at the time, and our teacher, Waya Timur, who's an amazing writer, she had us just do a lot of in-class writing prompts. And so I started with what is still now the first line of the book, which is "This morning Dolores was blue." And I was kind of just thinking to myself, like, okay, who is Dolores? Why is she turning blue? Why do we
you
care?
Didn't know she was an
I had
octopus.
no idea. It just sometimes names just come to me, and Dolores is like a really interesting name that it popped into my head. And so I thought about it, and I love writing about animals and the natural world. I find it very inspiring to think about. And so I decided, I was like, oh, I think she's an octopus, and she's changing colors. And I've always loved octopuses. I think they're super cool and fascinating, and also just so alien and weird in like a really interesting way that's so different from human beings, but that's still very accessible to think about. And so I decided, okay, she's an octopus, and let's put this in sort of a near future setting. And that's kind of how the world of the book came to be. And then also I started wondering about the voice of the character, who is my protagonist, Ro. And so it all kind of started from there, actually.
So you mentioned the near future setting of the book, which was so wonderfully nuanced and understated in a way that I loved. And you don't really know until the ex or the boyfriend takes off to Mars. And so can you talk a little about the germination of that idea as well?
Yeah, I liked the idea of it being sort of a breakup story, because like who doesn't relate to the catharsis and the utter depths of misery of like, being fresh out of a breakup. But I wanted to sort of heighten the reality by, he's not just leaving her, he's leaving the planet to go on this privately funded mission to colonize Mars. Which is a thing I think that is not that far off in our current future. And so, and the fact that I had this character of a Dolores, this larger than life giant Pacific octopus, I had a lot of fun thinking about what kind of origin and environmental zone she'd come from. And so she's from a place in the ocean that I made up called the Bering Vortex.
I Googled it.
Yeah.
It's not real.
A lot of people actually asked me, they were like, well, it's real, right? And I was like, it's actually not. But I mean, like, I liked the idea of it. And it's basically a very toxic, warmed over zone of our oceans that has spawned this sort of extra fantastical giant Pacific octopus, among other creatures, which I allude to in sort of the early portions of the book. I love speculative fiction. I think like the range of speculative fiction is so interesting to think about as a writer. And I also really think that there's something interesting about what if you had a sort of regular scenario, like a 30-year-old woman who's sort of burnt out at her job gets broken up with. And then how do you crank that up by adding in elements like the Mars trip or the fact that she works with this very fantastic creature? And so, yeah, I really loved thinking about that and playing with it.
Can you talk a little about the research process for the octopus? Did you actually go seek them out?
I would have loved to, but again, I was writing in 2020, and I wanted to try and go to an aquarium to like even just bother someone who works there to ask them questions about how it all works day to day. But everything was closed, and so I did a lot of research just by going on YouTube and kind of looking up day in the life of an aquarist type videos, of which there are a lot. And so it was really fascinating just watching the different aquarists like talking about their days and talking about the animals that they care for. And it's very clear that they all have a deep affection and respect for these animals. It's not just like a job for them. So that was really helpful, especially just watching octopuses move in relation to their caretakers. Like they'll like literally climb the walls to get fed. It's so interesting. They're like kind of like cats a little bit. And so I did a lot of research via YouTube, and then also just read anything I could find online about octopuses. And I just sort of kept this monster Google Doc of like facts and interesting things that I thought would eventually make their way into the book in some way.
And where were you writing?
I was writing in my apartment in Brooklyn, which I was sharing with 2 roommates at the time, and it was pretty small. I moved there in 2019, and then in 2020, when everything kind of shut down, I was just at my desk all day, working a day job, zooming into classes for my MFA program. And I just got so burned out doing that while also working on this novel that I decided I needed a place that wasn't the desk to work. And so I made a little I made a little nook in my closet at the time.
Wow.
And so I had a small bedroom, but the closet was like sizable for the bedroom. And so I just pushed all my clothes to the side and brought in a little chair and sat in my closet for a couple months.
Well, right now I'm taking turns writing in my master bathroom, right, to close myself off from my children. So the glamorous life of writers. Right?
How is that working, the bathroom?
Not well. So many things I loved, but since we're here, I also wanted to talk about how much I appreciated the variety of Korean characters in the book. You have such a range from the boyfriend, the boyfriend's mother, the best friend who's Korean, and her sisters, her mother, and of course Ro and her family, her immigrant parents. So, I mean, I don't think I've actually seen such a very, very nuanced, like wonderful New Jersey set of families. And I was wondering, were these taken from snapshots of your life growing up? And did you actually ever think about making some friends not Korean? I did. I think it's a conscious choice to have everyone Korean. So I wanted to ask about those artistic choices.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I wanted it to reflect the kind of world and community that I grew up in, which was, so I grew up in North Jersey, where the book is set in the suburbs. And I grew up in like a fairly white town in what is otherwise a rather diverse county of New Jersey. And so when I was growing up, my family, we were the only we were one of like 2, 3 maybe Asian American families, just generally. I went to a school where, it was me and like there was one other girl who was my friend who's Japanese American, and we got constantly mixed up for one another, like, how that happens in very white environments. And so I grew up kind of like just, reading a lot, reading mostly books with white characters, navigating this very white world at school. But then at the same time, my family is very church going. And so when we went to church on the weekends, we went to a Korean American church. And so it was, at the same time, we also had access to this incredibly like large and very warm, tight-knit Korean American community. And also outside of my town, we would go to places like Palisades Park or Fort Lee, Ridgefield to get like food and go shopping at the local Korean grocery store. So in some ways, it felt like I was navigating 2 very different worlds, which is a very common child of immigrants experience. And I was really curious about, when I was writing this novel, what it would look like to portray that world, the New Jersey Korean American extended universe that I grew up in, that I feel like is not really reflected in literature, even contemporary literature that's written by Asian Americans. And so at one point, the character of Yoonhee actually did start out as like a non-Korean character. I didn't know, her background fully yet. But then I decided it would be really interesting to have her be a childhood best friend, to come from this community, and what that would look like for this character who feels otherwise very divorced from that community in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like if you're setting it in the States, there's, in my own writing too, sometimes I think, oh, should I try to make it more diverse by not having only Korean characters, but then I revert. So I really wanted to ask you about your stories too. Are your characters in the upcoming collection? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you write about that diaspora?
I do. The short story collection, there's a little bit more just general diversity of characters in there because it's like a bunch of microcosms of stories. There's some characters who are from Korea and live there. Like there's one character that I'm very excited about she's a kumio, so she's a supernatural character, but it's set in Korea, like in, not in contemporary times. So I had fun with that. But I think like, for my first novel, I felt like I wanted to interrogate and sort of just portray the variety of what life can be like as a Korean American person growing up in this community.
And when you were working on your stories, were you kind of going back and forth between your novel and your short stories, or is it all just compartmentalized?
A lot of the short stories that are in the forthcoming collection, which Vintage is also publishing, they were kind of written.
What is the title?
Oh, it's called Green Frog, which for Korean
Amazing.
speakers, it's like 청개구리, like the 청개구리 story, which is a fairy tale.
You and animals, huh?
Yeah, another animal motif. And yeah, I wrote a lot of those short stories in kind of the earlier half of 2020. And some of them came out of writing that I was doing in my MFA program. Some of it was just taking online classes here and there, working on writing prompts from those. But when I was working on the novel, I kind of was just in that mode for a long time, because I think when you're in a novel, especially when you're trying to write a novel for the first time, which I was, it helped to stay immersed in it as possible.
So going back to Sea Change and the main character of Ro, she is such a kind of a damaged but optimistic but melancholy kind of character. And I think a lot of it comes from, the parents and the trauma from losing her father. Sorry for the spoiler. And I wanted to ask you a little about how much of her trauma do you think comes from the disappearance versus, I think, the immigrant trauma and the parental 갈등, like the conflict between the parents?
Yeah, I think it's all of it. I think in some ways her father's disappearance, it's obviously a huge trauma to for him to have gone missing when she's so young. She's 15 when he goes missing at sea. But I think the thing that really has sort of built up to the point where she is this extremely kind of damaged and traumatized individual at the point where we meet her in the book, a lot of that is because she's never been able to process that loss with her mother. She never talks about it with her. She doesn't really have the emotional vocabulary to talk about this loss. And I think all the conflicts too with her parents and what she sort of witnessed firsthand throughout her childhood. Her parents have a very troubled marriage. Her mother in particular often vocalizes that she wishes she had never come to the States. And I think Ro, as a child, she really internalizes that and starts to think like, well, I must be the source of all of my parents' problems. And I think when you grow up with that kind of idea, no matter how much support you might have otherwise, it's really hard to not see yourself as like this burden in a lot of ways. And I think she's also has a lot of abandonment issues, and I think it's exacerbated by the circumstances of her breakup. And I think with a character like that, or with a person like that, when you think that everyone is going to abandon you, you eventually start abandoning yourself in all these small ways that add up over time.
Yeah, I really felt for her in a not impatient way, though. I was rooting for her the whole time. She's such a likable character. Do you think that her parents, I don't know, we always have the what might have been if we hadn't, taken certain paths. And I think a lot of the immigrant story is, oh, what if we had stayed, back in our mother country? Do you think, in your mind, sliding doors wise, the parents' marriage would have been better had they stayed?
That's an interesting question. I think, I actually feel like their marriage was always sort of doomed from the start, just because they're very different people. Her father is such a kind of not practical dreamer, very idealistic, very smart, but not very good about staying tethered to the practical concerns of being part of a family. Whereas her mother is a little bit more, she has dreams of her own and plans of her own that she essentially has to shell when they move to the United States to start a new life together. I think if they had, in an alternative universe, if they had stayed there, I think her mother would have felt maybe more supported. Like she had resources there. She had her own family. So I don't know. It's interesting to think about. In some ways, I can see them potentially having stayed together if her mother felt more supported and stabilized. On the other, divorce rates in Korea are also pretty high. So
True.
yeah, so it's interesting to think about. But I think Rose's life would have been very, very different. Certainly had she been born in Korea.
I thought it was so funny that the characters are always surprised by their own choices to date other Koreans, and could you talk about that a little bit? It's like, oh, well, no one expected me to, but I ended up dating a Korean.
Yeah, I think Ro feels that when she starts dating Tae, who is the boyfriend who ends up leaving her for this space mission.
And Tae had dated non-Koreans before Ro.
And Tae, yes, and Tae has only dated white women before dating Ro. I think I wanted to put that in there because I think for many Asian Americans in today's day and age, there is this sort of sense that you have to like pick a side, right? Where it's like you can either stay really tethered to your community and kind of just live your life like that, or you have to join like the white world essentially. And obviously this is a false dichotomy. It's like a problematic idea to have grown up with. But I think, growing up in white supremacy, that's something that we all kind of grow up with. It's in the water that we swim in, so to speak. And so I think for Ro, the idea that she would not end up with, but end up in a relationship with someone who is so much more tied to her community in ways that she isn't, feels a little bit surprising to her in a way. I think with Yoonhee, who's her best friend in the book, it's a little bit different. Yoonhee is a character who's very kind of sure of what she wants, is very secure in her place in the world. And so for her, it's not a big deal that she ends up, getting engaged to a man who is part of this larger Korean American community. So I think with those two characters, like they represent sort of like composites of people I've known, people I've been in throughout my life. And I wanted to explore that in sort of a nuanced way, like what it looks like. Like there are so many different ways of obviously being Korean American. And yeah, I thought it was interesting to show that contrast with the two of them.
Yeah, I really recognized a lot of the different emotions associated with, being Korean in America. A lot of guilt about not speaking the language. I'm going through a little of that right now. If I revert to speaking English to my children and they're clearly reading more in English, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling a lot of guilt on the other side. And that whole part about Korean school and Ro having a fourth grade level of Korean and feeling slightly, wishing. Could you talk a little about that too?
Yeah, I definitely feel that as I learned this term recently, heritage speaker. So it's like someone who grew up, maybe fluent, hearing the language, speaking it. And before, at a certain point, realizing that they're more fluent in the English in the language that they've had to adopt as opposed to the mother language they grew up. That's definitely the case with me as a Korean American person who I think when I was really little, my parents actually, there's this funny story that they like to tell where, I only grew up speaking Korean with them. And so when I first went to school, like nursery school, they were very surprised because I did not enjoy nursery school. I was like not okay with the separation at first. And they were like, oh my God, she's crying, but she's saying mommy and not 엄마 in Korean. So it was like this weird little assimilation switch that flipped in my little child brain. But yeah, I mean, growing up now, I feel that my Korean is often quite lacking, especially when I'm talking to family in Korea or trying to like understand like a K-drama or something like that. So my language level is definitely halted at like a 4th, 5th grade level. Recently, I actually started doing Duolingo for Korean. It's very basic, but it's fun and reward based. So it's like, nice little dopamine hit every time you get another streak. But I feel like the thing for me has been the main challenge has been to get over the shame that I feel around it, but the shame and the guilt are really real. So it's a big thing to have to contend with,
Yeah, it's just so fascinating to see these snippets of the Korean diaspora and all the emotions associated with different experiences reflected in these incredible characters. And then I wanted to talk a little about 엄마 as well. So, I mean, I hate to give away so many spoilers, but the whole idea of moving on, 엄마 is moving on from the father, and that is incredibly hurtful to Ro. And again, there's this all kinds of, I feel like, shame and not guilt associated with, mother-daughter, kind of inflicting guilt, feeling abandoned. Can you talk a little about their relationship?
Yeah, Ro's mother was one of the most, I think, one of the hardest characters to write for me in the book. But I also loved writing her, especially in scenes with Ro, because there's so much that is unspoken between them that is both the source of their conflicts, but also the source of like deep love between them. I think for Ro, when she does get to the part of the book where she feels like her mother has sort of moved on from the loss of her father and she feels betrayed by it, I think some of that loss is that, or some of those feelings come from the fact that she wishes her mother had been able to talk to her at all about that, about, wanting to move on or, wanting to start a new chapter of her life. And so I feel like she feels both very left out of her mother's decisions in her life. And also, it's also that child part of her that's reacting and saying, like, how could you, betray the memory of my father in this way? And I think between the two of them, they both have so much that they haven't said to one another. And I think with Ro's mother, she loves her daughter so much and is also just, at times, really doesn't understand her. And that doesn't take away from the amount of love that they feel for one another. But towards the end of the book, there is a moment where, they are sort of able to see each other and hold one another in the light of their differences and the different choices that they've made in the wake of her father's absence.
I did think that scene was so representative of the intergenerational difficulty of communicating, within the Korean, not only in immigrant families where the second gen, there's that language barrier as well, but also within Korea too, there's still such a huge intergenerational communication breakdown and conflict. And it just makes you want to, I don't know, kind of shake them and be like, why can't you communicate better to each other about the important things? But at the same time, I think it's just very difficult. No one has really culturally talked to us about how to approach the most difficult, subjects in our families.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you, talk a little about your own experience with that, which might be a little difficult.
I think that's so true. I think some of that is the trauma, right? Like Korea as a nation has had such a difficult and violent history. And it's fascinating now as like a second generation Korean American and millennial to now see like the resurgence of Korean pop culture in our society, where it's like it's interesting to see and exciting, but also it always throws me back to the days of growing up in my very, very white town, surrounded by people who had no idea even like what Korea was outside of the context of the Korean War. So I always think in terms of like our trajectory as a people, like there are so many things that we are all cognizant of, but we still don't know how to talk about necessarily. And all those big events, they have a trickle down effect into our interpersonal relationships. So it's not surprising to hear that those generational differences still and conflicts still persist no matter where we are in the world. In my own experience with my family, I think that I grew up hearing so many stories of what like my parents' childhood was like. And I always loved hearing those stories. But at the same time, it was like, when I got a bit older, I think that the idea of trying to imagine my parents as young people was both very exciting for me and also like completely alien at the same time. And so writing fiction, I'm not writing about my family or my parents or myself necessarily, but I think it gives me an opportunity to think about those stories and have access in a way to versions of narratives that like I obviously wasn't around for and that I maybe will never be able to access in a way.
Yeah, I really wonder what impact this book would have had on me if I had read it growing up. I didn't even know it was possible until I read The Joy Luck Club to see Asian characters in English literature. So this would have been incredibly impactful. So I hope all young people get to read it. And speaking of family, what was the reaction in your own family when you started pursuing the arts? It's such an unusual, path to take. Everyone's always so shocked when you probably reveal yourself as a fiction writer in the Korean community. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, definitely. My parents are there, who are in the audience. They're very supportive of my writing career. I think, ever since I was a kid, I was always a big reader. I was always writing stories and illustrating them and handing them stapled copies to be like, hey, here's my novel. And I think that, to their credit, they were never the stereotypical, like, you have to, like, go be a doctor or engineer or lawyer or something. Like, I mean, I think there's a part of my dad probably that wishes I'd gone to business school, maybe. But instead of getting an MBA, I went and got my MFA.
Opposite.
The complete opposite. But when I did it, I think they were kind of relieved in a way, because they were like, well, okay, we understand school. Like, that's a place you go to, like, gain specialized knowledge about
that's
something.
How you trick the Korean parents. It's kind of like an MBA.
Yeah. It's an MBA for learning how to write stories about made-up people.
And in the larger kind of community, Korean American community, what has the reception been?
Oh, it's interesting. I've gotten some notes from readers, from early copies of the book, and also from folks now that the book is officially out in the world, saying really lovely things about how, one friend told me that they also wondered what it would have been like to have read this book at a younger age, and that meant so much to me, because I definitely wrote this book in part for a younger version of myself that felt so alone and unseen and so angry because of that, and so that means so much to me to hear. I've also gotten a lot of notes from non-Korean readers as well, who are maybe also from an immigrant background, saying that they felt very connected to the story for a lot of different reasons. But I think that it is, for me, fundamentally a book about a Korean American person who's trying to find her way in the world and understand how she's gotten there as a result of, like, her experiences and within the context of her own family. So it's meant a lot to get those notes. Yeah.
Amazing. And how many octopus stuffies have you received since this was published?
I think I have at least 3 that I can think of off the top of my head. And then I also have, like, octopus art. I have a lot of art on my walls at home. And honestly, half of it was, like, me buying little trinkets for myself to, like, motivate myself to finish this book. I bought a little, like a ceramic octopus that I would place on my desk when I was like, it's time to write. And, like, it would, like, supervise me. Yeah. So there's a lot of it at home.
Speaking of time to write, I wanted to ask about your writing process. What is your day-to-day life like as a writer? I'm sure we have people who are watching who have never, met a Korean novelist in real life. So could you walk us through the day of Gina Chung writing?
Yeah, well, I'm not a daily writer for sure. I've tried to be. I'd love to be one of those people who wakes up at 5 a.m. and bangs out a couple thousand words, but I've tried, and especially when in the thick of writing this novel, and it didn't really work. Like, everything that I wrote was I was like, no, this is no good. Like, my brain just doesn't really wake up until 11 a.m. maybe. Even if I'm physically awake, my friends know this. I'm just not present.
God,
mentally.
I'm normal. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have to have had multiple hours out of bed with coffee to actually form a sentence. So I tend to be more of a night writer. So I wrote this book, majority of it, between the hours of 10 p.m. into 1 to 2 a.m., which is not a healthy schedule, especially if you have a 9 to 5, the way that I did and still do. But it was what worked for me. And I think also working in 2020 when we were all kind of virtually Zooming in everywhere, it just made it that much easier, where I didn't have to worry about getting up early to then get on the subway and go on a long commute. And to this day, I think I feel I've made peace with the fact that I'm not a daily or a morning writer. And most of my process now is actually just I'm working on revisions for my short story collection and also working in bits and pieces on my next novel. And for that one, because it's so much newer, it's mostly just writing down images or thoughts or questions I have in my iPhone notes app. It's very chaotic and disorganized, but that's sort of how I keep the sparks of things alive before I eventually sitting down and writing it down. And then I've been in a handwriting kind of mode lately, especially whenever I do draft. And I feel like that helps free up any anxieties I have about it not being perfect, which it never is and never is going to be. So I always like to remind myself that perfect is the enemy of the good when it comes to drafting.
Yeah, I like to call it word vomit.
Yeah.
You just need to vomit in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And then you let it sit, and sometimes
Yep.
it's actually not as bad as you remember it being, and that's a great day.
Yeah. One day, that day will come. And so when did you talked about how you wanted to be a writer as a child, but what did that career course look like? How did you decide to embark on this path?
Yeah. I think as a pretty young child, I was reading and writing all the time, really determined to be a writer. Actually, and then you brought up Joy Luck Club. I remember my mom gave me a copy of it, and she was like, "You should be the Korean American Amy Tan." And I was like, "I'm going to be the Korean American Amy Tan." But then you get older. Thank you. But I think as you get older, you get more self-conscious about your writing and your art. And as the child of immigrants, I couldn't get away from this idea that I had to do something practical, even though my parents weren't necessarily like pressuring me to do so. And so, I majored in like literature, like literary studies in college, and was always taking writing classes here and there. But I didn't really think of myself as a writer. I actually stayed away from it for a long time. And I had a lot of shame around the idea or the ambition of wanting to become a writer because it's so hard, and it's a difficult path. And I thought to myself, like, well, I'll always love books and reading and literature, and so I'll go into publishing, and that's how I'll build a career, but also stay close to this world of writing and writers. And so my first like official adult job out of school was working at Penguin. This was before they became Penguin Random House. This was a very long time ago. And I worked in publicity there and learned a lot. And then got another publishing job after that doing editorial work. But honestly, it's not a pathway I necessarily recommend for other writers, because I think when you're quite young and emerging and nascent as a writer, it doesn't always benefit you to like go straight into the business of books. I think some people can do it, and that's amazing. But for me, I think it was very educational in terms of thinking about the business of marketing and selling a book, which is all important for a writer to know about. But it kind of hampered me and made me feel very self-conscious about my own writing. So I actually had to leave that world for a little bit to then start thinking about and building up ambitions towards potentially publishing my own writing someday.
I guess if you're constantly confronted with the most polished versions of, books that have been worked on for years, then you do lose confidence when you're a budding writer.
Right. And I was also working I was at an adult commercial nonfiction imprint, so very different from the stuff that, I was interested in writing. But like we had celebrity writers, and so, their trajectory for that kind of book is so different. And so it's fascinating, but it didn't necessarily inspire me to write, if that makes sense.
I think we'll open up for some questions from the audience. I hope you brought your burning questions for Gina. Vanessa.
You mentioned how you wrote your first sentence before you decided Dolores was an octopus. Because it was such a spontaneous decision, at any point while drafting and being in the horrid drafting cave, did you begin to have any second thoughts like, shoot, I shouldn't have made Dolores
a monkey,
yeah, like any other, or was it an obvious like it couldn't be anything but an octopus because it's just your natural love for that specific animal?
Yeah, I felt like I never questioned making her an octopus, although there were points in the research where I was like, how am I going to incorporate all of this into the book? I did have questions for myself about Rose's job, which is working at the aquarium, just because I think that was harder to learn about than the actual like day-to-day care and feeding of an octopus. I think it would have been, for me, she couldn't have really been anything else. But there were definitely other things that I thought about changing a lot. Like while I was writing, I was like, oh no, I've bitten off more than I can chew. But, it all worked out in the end.
Hannah.
Hi, Gina. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yay. So I wanted to ask you about writing Appa's character. I felt like so much of his storyline is so mysterious, and it's also what you've done is you've really pulled off this amazing feat of like writing an absence, like writing about the absence of someone. Of course, there are the scenes like earlier on before his disappearance, but I wanted to ask about how you approach that character and kind of the mystery around him and that kind of unresolved feeling.
Yeah, I wanted to write him in a way that, was going to be like truthful to the trajectory and the flaws of this character, but also make it very clear the close, like why he and his daughter were so close and the things that he does pass on to Ro before he unfortunately disappears. And, he's a marine biologist, he's a scientist, and so he has this sort of innate natural curiosity about the world. I think that's also the source of his sort of optimism about the world too, where I think for anyone who spends that much time studying the natural world, I feel like you either develop a real sort of optimism about the resiliency of nature or a real sort of protectiveness of it, right? Or both in some cases. And I think he passes that down to his daughter in that he's always telling her to pay attention to things, to look at the process of things and to look at the world. And I think that she really carries that through the rest of the book too. And so that felt important to me. I also wanted to include those earlier scenes that you mentioned just because I think it's always helpful for me as a reader, even if a writer is not necessarily going into the childhood scenes of a character, like it's always helpful for me to think like, okay, this is probably the kind of kid who like ate glue at recess. Got it. And so I wanted to show, like how her interactions with her parents, especially her father, would go on to shape her as a young adult.
I finally thought of something, Frances.
Hi, Vanessa.
So I think the audience should know that this started as a short story. This novel started as a short story. Can you talk to us about its journey and its expansion into the 270 odd pages that it is today?
Yeah, so Vanessa is one of the people who saw this book before it became a book when it was just a short story. And I actually didn't come into my MFA program with a novel idea. Like a couple of my friends did, or they got ideas for their novels like while we were all working on stuff. I didn't. I was pretty content working on short stories. I didn't have an idea that I felt I could stay with for longer than that. So I wrote, the first couple paragraphs of what would become Sea Change and brought it to my writing group during the summer of 2020. And I was like, it's a short story, but, I know I have to wrap it up. I don't really know. And they were all like, what are you talking about? There are so many unanswered questions in this excerpt. We think this could be longer. And so never having written a novel before, I was like, okay, I'll try doing that. And so it all felt very experimental at first until, I sort of became committed to the completion of it while working on it. And so that was the story of how it really came to be, more than just a couple paragraphs about a sad girl.
Hi, Gina.
Hi,
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to be here. I think one of the favorite things about your book for me is the rich relationships between all the characters. I'm specifically really interested in the relationship between women in your book, and would love to hear you talk more about how do you cultivate those relationship dynamics, or what well do you draw from as you develop those characters?
Yeah, I love that question. I also wanted it to be a book that was primary. I mean, obviously, it starts off with the story of her breakup with Tay, her ex-boyfriend. But I wanted to explore what it looks like what it would look like for the female characters in this novel to sort of care for one another and what the politics and dynamics of that care would look like. I'm thinking of your book as well, Frances, and how that book becomes so much more about the relationships between the various women in the novel, and like how powerful that can be. But also at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that their relationships are always positive and conflict free. Like there is a great deal of conflict and tension between Ro, my main character, and her best friend, and also her mother. And there's another character in the book named Rachel, who is Ro's cousin, and she's sort of outside of the main conflicts, but she's very much a part of Ro's life. She's going through a divorce of her own, and also caring for a young daughter. And the reason I introduced Rachel to the story was because I felt like she was a way for Ro to learn how to take care of someone else. Because I noticed that, Ro is not very good at taking care of herself throughout the story, but whenever I had her interacting with someone else and trying to care for their needs or ask them what they needed, she was actually quite good at that. And so I think Rachel is a character that sort of forces her to think more about what it means to exist in relation to the other women in her family. Yes, yeah.
In relation to your book. And I was wondering, in your book, what do you feel, how did you develop the main character's development in terms of her learning how to care about somebody else and maybe grow in a way that maybe was missing in her relationship with the boyfriend, but now that she had a relationship with this animal who taught her some things about what it's like to really care?
Yeah. So with Octopus Teacher specifically, it actually, I think it came out right before I started working on my book. And so I wanted to watch it because I love octopuses. It's a beautiful movie. But I was like, I don't want to watch it while I'm working because I don't want it to like influence necessarily the relationship between Ro and the octopus in my book. I did watch it eventually and found it to be very beautiful and moving. And it also confirmed my belief that octopuses are just like the best and that they are capable of developing emotionally complex relationships with human beings. I think that there's so much there in what you just said about how learning to take care of others and yourself can also come through taking care of something that's, so different from like another human being. And so, she has this job where she's taking care of these creatures and sort of like has a encyclopedic knowledge of all of their different needs. And yet at the same time, when she goes home at the end of the day, she's so bad at taking care of herself, so bad at checking in on her loved ones and taking care of her relationships. I think she's not the hinge that sort of changes that is when she realizes that she could lose it all. So the sort of inciting incident of the book, so it's not a spoiler, is that she learns that Dolores is going to be sold to a private investor. And it's at that moment that she really has to really start to confront what this octopus means to her and what the relationships in her life mean to her and what she's sort of letting go if she doesn't make the same effort there that she makes with the animals that she cares for.
Oh, and congratulations. We're fellow new schoolers, and yay, new school. I'd love to know, the most valuable thing you got out of the program and maybe any advice that you would have for us. We're also in the MFA program for fiction.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much for coming. Advice. I don't know that I'm qualified to give advice. So with the program, I feel like I entered into it in the fall of 2019, had about a semester and a half of like in person before everything went virtual. And I feel so lucky that I got to have the time at the new school that I did, even with all that going on. I worked with Mira Jacob, who, if you haven't taken a class with her yet, if you get a chance to work with her, like she's amazing. And she read early drafts of this book when it was just my thesis for the new school and was so instrumental and insightful in sort of helping me shape it to become the book that it is. And I also just met the most wonderful people ever, and many of them are here tonight, which is amazing. And I think in terms of advice for anyone in any MFA program, it's just good to remember to yourself like why you're there necessarily. And that's a really basic thing, I know, but it's helpful to remind yourself like that you're there to work on your craft, and therefore your journey through that program is going to be different than everyone else's journey. Everyone's there to get better at their writing and, maybe seek the connections they need to take their writing to the next level. But I think that does look different for everyone. And for me, what I really wanted in my program going into it was community and time, and like the structured time that I would need in order to like actually work on my writing. And so I think keeping those in mind is always really helpful. And also, if you're at a slightly larger program like the New School, it helps to be a squeaky wheel too in terms of thinking about seeking out resources that you need, especially if you are writing from a place of being a marginalized person from any context. I think it's always helpful to think about, what you can get out of the resources that you're provided with, but also be mindful of the fact that this wasn't necessarily, I'm not referring to the New School administrators, but like just talking about the history of the MFA program, like that wasn't built with us in mind, right? So how can we find our place within it and help pull each other along the way?
I think, Frances, you want to ask her the last question?
Yeah, that was an incredibly enlightening talk. Thank you for that. And my final question is, what was your favorite scene to write? Which kind of surprised you as it was unfolding?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think my favorite scene to write was the scene. There's an interlude later in the book where in one of the childhood flashback scenes, Ro goes on a rare family vacation with her family to Hawaii while her dad is there for a marine biology conference. And it was fun to get the family out of their usual environment and sort of figure out how, I think everyone's a little bit different on vacation, right? Like that's why we go away. So it was fun writing what her parents and how their interactions with one another would change, and perhaps maybe the tension would dissipate if they were in a new environment. And so I had a lot of fun writing that. And then there's a scene at the end of that chapter that it was so vivid in my mind. I knew I wanted to get there, but I didn't know how. And so that was one of the scenes that I reworked a couple different times with both my agent before we sent the book out to publishers and also with my editor. And it really helped to hear like the feedback in terms of the pacing and how we get there. And then eventually the way that I did get to that final scene, I feel like it took a lot of tries and reworkings, but it was like, I normally really don't like the revision process. It's very painful for me. But that one was really fun just because I knew that the payoff would be worth like all the labor to get there. So yeah, that's probably the one.
It's a beautiful ending.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Gina and Frances for this wonderful conversation. For those of you, please purchase the books so that you can get your copy autographed. But congratulations, Gina, on your debut novel. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
And thank you, Frances, again, for joining us. And hope everybody has a great night. Thank you so much.